So, hello everyone. My name is Mehdi Belmekki. I'm technical consultant from Alfresco. Today I'll be presenting the unlocking the secrets of Alfresco authentication presentation. So I will be discussing and presenting the authentication systems on Alfresco share site, Alfresco repository site. So the agenda for today will be, I will start by introducing myself. Later, I will give the talk objectives, talk about repository authentication mechanism, the share authentication mechanism, and external authentication subsystem, and how both applications gets configured with the external authentication. Later, I will provide you with an external SSO demo. So I will provide an external single sign-on configuration demo for both repository and share site. And after that, directly I will share in with you some debugging tricks in order to help you design your own configuration to get this working with your current authentication system. At the end, if anyone have any question, I'll be happy to answer. So, starting by introducing myself, as I said, my name is Mehdi Belmekki. I'm 5 years experiences on Alfresco. I start working around Alfresco in the community. So I learned fast and spent most of my time discovering new features and what have been developed added day by day by the engineers in the nightly builds. After that, I worked with the partners and joined Alfresco. I'm based in Paris, and here is my email address. If anyone later have any question, feel free to ask me. So, the talk today, I aim from this talk to give you a global overview of how the authentication works on both applications, so the Alfresco web application and Share web application. As I said, I want as well to explain to you how Share gets authenticated on the repository, and how external authentication works with both applications, so how it is configured and how it fits with both applications. And hope that after this presentation, everyone will be able to configure by himself the SSO filter for both applications. As we will see, it's an easy thing, starting from version 4, too many things changed comparatively to old versions. So I will be starting, as I said, talking about the repository authentication. I'll give you an overview about before subsystems. So I'm talking now about Alfresco up to version 3.2, where we start up to version 3.1, sorry, where we started introducing subsystems. So we used to have one Spring configuration file subdivided into teamed file, but loaded on the same Spring application context. If we want to use our custom, I would say, authentication mechanism, we used to override this bean in order to implement our own, which was dependent on other component defined and other beans defined in Alfresco. So this generates that we have everything was globally managed in one file. We have one configuration file, not too many. It was hard to separate dependencies. So since your custom code or your custom authentication component was dependent on Alfresco code, each upgrade was, I say, painful, and it was difficult. Actually, with the old mechanism, if we want to do a test of our configuration, something like this, we used to start the server. If it fails, we change the configuration and restart the server in order that it takes effect. And even switching between different authentication mechanisms was a bit, say, complicated, since it involved simultaneous editing of several files at the same time. Template configuration was not introduced at that time, so since we had everything loaded on the single Spring config file, we had a problem of namespace uniqueness problem. So we cannot reuse or define a bean with the same name of or the same ID of another bean. We should always copy paste and change the bean name in order so Alfresco can load both beans. That's what we used to use when we want to configure two LDAP repositories for Alfresco, for example. We introduce subsystems, as I say, starting from version 3.1. So subsystems is a separate module. It's a small application. It's small. It's like a plugin which loads its own Spring config context. So there is no problem of uniqueness namespace problem like before. We can specify too many beans with the same name since it belongs to different subsystems. With the subsystems introduced as well, we introduced, since it is separate component, we can start, stop this component without stopping the whole server. So if we have any problem, for example, now on the production, let's say we have too many subsystems configured to run on the production for the authentication, too many authentication mechanisms involved on our production. We have a problem in one mechanism. We will not shut down the whole server, the whole Alfresco server. We will shut down the subsystem where we have the problem, and there will be no downtime for us. So this is a feature introduced by the subsystems. And the subsystems are a bit isolated from Alfresco code. So it is natively supported by, even if you upgrade. No need to change your custom code, no need to reconfigure. Everything you can do is just upgrade your application, and all your customization or subsystem will be working. So these services I was talking about are exposed to enterprise in the enterprise version in the GMX console. So you can find the properties for each subsystem. You can modify it directly on the fly, directly live. You can start, stop, and revert the configuration directly through the GMX. One feature which was introduced as well with the subsystem is that when you change something in the GMX and you have a clustered environment, you don't need to change the configuration file everywhere because properties of subsystems are stored directly on the database. So it is broadcasted on all servers. All servers are refreshed directly. So if you want to define your own subsystem component, you should define an authentication component which handles specific of the token to the backend authentication subsystem involved in Alfresco side. You should as well define your own authentication data access object, which will decide and manage function like allowing creating users, updating users, delete users, and some similar functions. The authentication service wrap the authentication component with the DAO layer in order to provide high-level functions to create users and to get authenticated using our subsystem. You should define as well your own authentication filters, unless you want to use Alfresco's default one, in order to provide filter to get authentication for the web client, which is the old, the Explorer web client. You should as well define your own WebDAV filter if needed, or if you use WebDAV, and the web script filter, SharePoint protocol filter as well if you need. And for the file server authenticator as well, you can define your own component or your own mechanism to and embed it in your subsystem, so Alfresco gets the user authenticated for the CIFS protocol and the FTP protocol. So here I will be presenting our out-of-box provided subsystems, which I think is a bit complete, and it covers almost all our customers' need, unless you have a corner case in your authentication mechanism. So you have the Alfresco NTLM, which is the native Alfresco database, so the internal user that's used on the database directly subsystem. You have the LDAP subsystem, which can be configured in order to connect to an LDAP server or several LDAP servers as well. Both, sorry about that. We have the LDAP, as I said, that it can be configured to export users from an LDAP registry or get the authentication delegated to an LDAP server. You have the external subsystem that we will be talking about later during this presentation, which delegates the authentication to an external third-party application, which can be CAS, Central Authentication, or JOSO, JASIG, or any other authentication application server. We have the Kerberos subsystem, which get authentication with the Kerberos realm, and the pass-through authentication subsystem, which get used with the NTLM for the single sign-on. The advantage of subsystem, as I was explained before, other than restarting, other than these are subsystems are separate from Alfresco and be started and configured without restarting Alfresco and all the things. So you can use a stack, you can use more than one subsystem and use it on a chain configuration that you can configure directly on your Alfresco global. So say this, I will use more than one authentication mechanism, and each authentication subsystem can be configured for, let's say, for example, have the LDAP in order to authenticate CFS users and use the Alfresco NTLM to authenticate the web application users. So it gives you more flexibility. With the subsystems, you can use templating. So you have common parameters which are shared between all your subsystems instances. So you can just copy paste your subsystem. For example, let's take as example the LDAP servers. You can just copy paste the LDAP subsystem and configure both subsystems only by changing the properties file. No need to change on the XML file. It's template part and it's be working even if the component and the beans IDs are similar. There will be no problem with that. So no need anymore to change your web.xml file in Alfresco web application or share web application, because up to version 3.1, when we want to at least get, for example, the SSO working for the applications, we used to change the web XML file in order to introduce a new filter, which will check the authentication on an external authentication application and get the ticket and exchange the ticket, validate the ticket, and all the stuff. So each time we upgrade, we should take back again the section configured on the web XML and put it again on the new application. This stop, no more need for similar stuff. With the subsystem, you will not need never to touch your web XML file. So here I'll be talking about chaining mechanism. So what is chaining? Chaining, you ask to Alfresco to use several subsystems instances in order to authenticate the user. Alfresco will try these subsystems one by one and in order that you will provide. And if one of these subsystems respond OK or get the user authenticated, Alfresco will accept the users. Otherwise, it will reject and stop the authentication. So this is what you can see here on the graph. So as I said, now with Alfresco, we provide you with a generic filter that we'll call in the web XML, that we'll call our chaining subsystem class in order to iterate over all the chaining subsystems instances that you already specified, as I said, in Alfresco global properties, and that you can start directly in the GMX console. No need of restarting the server. So this charts recapitulate, I will say, the Alfresco repository authentication mechanism. So this is an example. We have user requests that come through the authentication filter, gets handled by the chaining subsystem factory, which will try to get the current user authenticated in the defined subsystems. In this case, as example, I gave the LDAP, the Alfresco NTLM, and the external one. So if we have one OK from the three subsystems, the user gets authenticated. Otherwise, the login page will be fired. So now we're talking about share authentication. Share, as you know, it's a light application built on the top of Alfresco using Surf Spring framework. So it's a client application which asks the repository each time to get information from the repository and render it using the Surf framework and Yahoo UA stuff. So in order to communicate with the repository, share need to get authenticated on the repository in order to ask for documents, for permissions, for all the stuff that is exposed in our collaboration application. So in order to get this authentication working, we use connectors, which are components defined on the Surf framework side. And I will be discussing this in deep details in this slide. So in share side, we have a configuration which is for the authentications, which involve 4 components. We have the endpoints, which define a remote location endpoint URL. So it's generally, by default, the repository URL for the services. So the remote location that will provide share with the information that we want to render. And it defines as well a share connector. The connector is responsible of establishing communication between the repository and the share side. And it calls an authenticator in order to do a handshake when the authentication is needed. Otherwise, these connectors, for example, are used as well if you have experts. I would say if you are using Alfresco Share, you can, I will give you as example where we use connector. For example, Dashlet in order to get time trains from Yahoo API. We use connector in order to call in HTTP a remote location and get the time train table and render it in our Dashlet. This connector is used and called on this communication. And the same connectors are used to make share communicate with the repository side as well. So as I said, you have the authenticators, which are optional component and which are called only when there is an authentication, only when authentication is needed between the 2 applications. And these authenticator use credentials, which can be Alfresco ticket or username and the password. So now we're talking about external authentication subsystem and how it fits with this single sign-on system. So the external authentication subsystems allow Alfresco to trust an external, I would say, authentication server and use the token and use the decision to authenticate or not the user based on a token given by an external entity. So the out-of-box provided external subsystem is already configured in order to fit with measure, I would say, a number of SSO solutions like, as I said before, GAS SSO, JASIG, JOSO, and other, even Ciboleth as well. So we should be aware that activating this subsystem is a bit, I say, I will not say dangerous, but we should be aware that we should at least be sure that no untrust direct access to the system can be done from the outside or from the HGP ports, because Alfresco will trust a property sent on the header that you will specify. So if anyone can hack this header property, which I will do on my demo as well, I will hack it in order to get authenticated, but it's for demo purpose, and it should not be produced on your deployment servers. You should be sure that there is no untrust authentication to the repository side. So prior to Alfresco 4, as I said, we used to define our own filter on the WebXML for the repo side, on the WebXML for share side, in order to point both applications to get authenticated on our authentication application server. We used to define our custom connector, which validate the ticket between both applications against, again, the external entity. And this connector, we should sometimes, not all the times, define our custom authenticator as well. And at the end, define a custom web script on the repository side that will get the ticket from share and then check with the external entity for validating the ticket or reject it in order to reject the authentication. Starting from version 4, all of this disappears with the introduction of subsystem configurations. So as I said, no need to change the WebXML files, no need to code your own web script. Alfresco provide you by, I say, generic one that will do the job for you. It's easy to maintain, it's upgradable, no need to change your custom code if you defined any, no need no pain, I would say, even on the upgrade, and it's easy to maintain as well since it's external. So there is no risk to change. So these are the steps now to configure your external authentication to get SSO working on Alfresco repository and share. We have 2 steps. One, configuration on the repository side in Alfresco global properties. Everything you need to do is to add the external one, which is an instance of the external subsystem. It's already configured for you out of the box. The default configuration is working. unless you need some specific tuning or something like this, you can change the default configuration or copy paste it and have your own instance of external subsystem, and then you can configure your own based on your needs. That we will see on the demo as well. On the share side, we provide you as well with a working share configuration with the endpoints, with the connectors, with the external connectors. Everything you need is to change, is to increment this section on your configuration sample, it's provided, and replace the Alfresco cookie with the header connector. Why replacing Alfresco cookie with the header connector? Because Alfresco cookie is used for SSO with the NTLM stuff. When you want to use SSO with the NTLM, keep using the Alfresco cookie. When you want to use Alfresco share with the external single sign-on, you should use the header connector. This connector is introduced starting from version 4.1 latest and 4.2. You cannot find it before these versions. So, and then you should set up on your own application. Ask, for example, I think Jasik allow to do this using graphical interface on the web. So say if the user gets authenticated, please add this header variable to the header to all the requests. So other applications can get the authenticated user from the header variable. Now it's demo time. So as I will show you, so everything that needs to be done is, as I said, in the Alfresco global properties, you need to add your external subsystem in your chain. So Alfresco will, the chain component will understand that it should take care of asking the external subsystem in the Alfresco NTLM. You can use any other LDAP if you want, or several LDAP instances, or whatever you want. You can add it to the chain, and Alfresco will take care of asking these components. In the share side, this is the section that you may need to increment. So it's about the remote location. You have the Alfresco cookie connector, which, as I said, was used and provided by default to get used with the NTLM SSO stuff. For our demo, we'll use the Alfresco header connector. As you can see here, I commented the default one and reused the Alfresco header one. Here, for demo purpose, I changed the user header because you can specify two header properties, one for share side and one for the repo side. And each one will be used by, each application will have its own header variable to trust. But for demo purpose, I used the same header property name to authenticate both applications. So here in the external authentication properties, you can specify your administrator username, and the external filter properties, you can specify the header remote, the header properties, the remote header properties, and enable or disable the authentication, the external authentication subsystem. You can as well use user ID patterns if you want to send in the header the user ID with a salt and then extract it using a regular expression. And you can use a proxy username in order to, let's say, Alfresco will use this username in order to execute all the requests coming from or through the authentication, the external authentication subsystem. For this demo, I used Firefox and the modify header plugin. This modify header it's a plugin. It's an open source free plugin that is provided with Firebug that you can use in order to define your own header properties. So for this example, I decided to add a header properties for all requests that go through Firefox, and add X Alfresco remote user property with the value of username admin. I started my header changes. Let me just be sure that I don't have existing cookies, something like this. the user that gets authenticated is problems. So it's the administrator directly, because Alfresco trusts now the header variable that I sent with the username. So as you can see, you have your activities. You can access or create your sites. You can do whatever. You are connected like the administrator to this site, to the application, to Alfresco Share. Let's test now Alfresco, the repo site. Alfresco, see how it goes there. So as well, it's directly authenticated as the admin. So you can browse, manage your files, do whatever you want. So as I explained before, the external authentication with this SSO now, it's as easy as 2 steps. Configure global properties with this variable, and uncomment, not even configure share, but uncomment the configured share, the configured section provided in the share sample file. So now I will finally sharing with you some debugging tricks when you want to define your own authentication subsystem, or you configured the existing subsystems and you have any problem with that and you want to understand what's going on. You can, in the repository side, enable login by enabling login for the SSO authentication filter, which is a generic filter I was talking about that gets the username from the outside, from the requests. And you can enable the authentication util as well in order to get details on step-by-step authentication on the repository side. Starting from version 4.2, you can enable the chaining service login in order to have information about which chaining components and which subsystem accept and the user authenticated and which one rejected. So the result should be something like this. So you have, for example, here, my SSO failed, another SSO failed, and the Alfresco NTLM accepts the authentication. So you have details on your log file, and you can track which subsystem is working and which is not. Now for the share side, you can enable the login for the default remote user map that this class normally gets the remote user from the requests. And for me, I recommend to enable the debug for the whole package for the connector in order to have a deep view with details about how the communication is going on with the share side and the repository side. So how the communication is, the communication is established between both applications. And in order to debug your header variables, there is no best tool I found during my experience with Alfresco other than Firebug that gives you details about the header variables and everything exchanged, even in low level when you are using the network console. And I advise to use modify header, which is stable plugin that I always use in order to force the authentication in Alfresco and test my external authentication subsystem mechanism. So that was all for my presentation. If anyone have any question, be happy to answer. Yeah.
A couple questions. First one is, our existing customers use an external provider, Ping Federate, Ping Identity, for SAML authentication?
Not yet. It's currently, it's now being developed by Alfresco for our own use, and maybe it will be, it will be provided later for the community and for the in the enterprise version. But SAML, yes, we are working on it, but customers, personally, I did not work with anyone working on the SAML stuff. Sibolet,
In version 3, there was a JOSO tool that I guess would do
still working.
4 also.
Exactly. It's still working. But it should change some configuration because JOSO you can set up directly using the command line. So it's set up out of box configuration and they think it's working with the 3, 4 or something like this. But things change between 3, 4, and 4. And you should, I would say, disable, remove some custom code added by the Joseph set installer rather than coding or doing your custom stuff in order to make it work. You should just remove some sections which generate conflicts.
Are there any instructions on how to do that that
Not on our wiki. It should be debugged using the debugging tricks I already provide, but I worked on it, and you can get it working with no problem.
How is this going to interact in a multi-tenant environment?
It's not working with the SSO. External SSO is not working with the multi-tenant environment right now. It's not supposed to be working. There is a plan on the future since we need it on the cloud as well, but I'm not sure if it will be merged with the enterprise version as well or not. But let's see. There is probably it should be provided to our customers if customers need it and it exists. We should provide them. There is no need to keep it for Alfresco users only. But definitely, too many customers start asking about that since they want to provide their own customers as well with cloud solution based on Alfresco, so everyone needs it. And maybe it can be included on the new version of Alfresco, the next versions, for sure.
Is that going to be just for enterprise, or will it be included in the community also?
There is no plan to include it right now, but I think it should be for the enterprise first. Yep.
The Alfresco cookie method of authentication,
Mm-hmm.
is that primarily for development, or do you recommend that for production?
You can go with it for production, but you will need to use it for the NTLM, as I said, SSO. It will not work with the external stuff. The external, you should use Alfresco header, and you can go with everything we provide you out of the box. It's not sample stuff. It's included on org Alfresco repo site. So it's ready for production, and it's well, I would say, strong enough in order to go to the production and secure.
So the Alfresco cookie uses NTLM?
Exactly.
And is it V1 or 2?
Sorry, V1, V1. It's with the V1 now. But it can be, there are some configurations that can be done on the subsystem side, not on the share side, in order to get the V2 working. It works with Kerberos, I think, as well, the NTLM version 2. It works with Kerberos. Can be enabled with the pass-through and Kerberos. Yep.
Can we use this external authentication with CAFS
Subsystem, actually, not sure about that. No, it's not supposed to be working. It's not the CAFS stuff is not provided with the current default subsystem, external authentication subsystem. But it's easy to define your own filter. As I said, when you want to define the whole subsystem, you define filter for file servers. So you can define for the CFS and FTP one. You have the first block, which is provided by Alfresco, so you can get your user authenticated on the WebDAV, SharePoint protocol, and the other stuff. It's provided by the existing external subsystem. So everything you will need is to implement your filter in order to get the file servers authentication on this subsystem. Yep. Question. Can you repeat? Actually, if I understand well, you can change and customize the header property name, but there is no graphical interface to do that actually right now. There is graphical interface, but in the external your authentication application. So for JustSig, as I said as example, you have a graphical user interface in order to set up like rules. You say when the authentication is succeed, please add the header variable with this name and put this value. This is doable, I think, by JustSig. I already seen it by JustSig. Exactly. Should be. Should be because it's provided in the DAO, as I said when I was discussing the subsystems components. This is managed by the DAO data access object layer, and it's provided so users which are not actually it's external. So Alfresco will not even check if the user exists on the database, since you specify that you want to use NTLM as well. Otherwise, it will trust the external header. I still have the exactly. You should define your groups on the Alfresco side, and in this case, you will need to keep. No, it's okay. You can drop out the Alfresco NTLM subsystem. No need to authenticate user. But in order to manage your users under groups, you should define your groups in the Alfresco side. It's not like LDAP when you can import the groups with the users. These things can be managed by Alfresco, not the subsystem. Because the subsystem will just decide allow, disallow, go, no go. It's just for authentication. If you want to add permissions to the user or anything else, you can do it directly on Alfresco, like if you are doing it for an internal. Because the copy is created for the authenticated user the first time it logs on the system. Okay. Yep.
Actually, follow up on that. So, authentication, the subsystem is for authentication. So, once the user is created and end up, you have other attributes you want to import for that user.
Can be done.
So,
how to configure that?
Through subsystem, obviously.
Yep. How?
It wouldn't be through the authentication subsystem. It has to be somewhere else.
We can do both. We can use both subsystems, the LDAP one and the external one. Say the external, put it on the first chaining level in order to get the authentication. Use the LDAP with the synchronization. So we import the users, and the external authentication subsystem will authenticate or not the current user he gets, and Alfresco will use the same username, and we'll have the properties from the LDAP stuff.
And that subsystem can also import the attributes?
Yep. The LDAP can get synchronization with the LDAP server and gets even groups for you. Okay. You can activate synchronization between Alfresco and the LDAP server, or many instances if you want. It's easy to do. Just copy paste your subsystem and you will get many instances of this subsystem for the LDAP. And there is, which I didn't put on my slides because it's just a variable of LDAP subsystem, which is LDAP Active Directory subsystem. And it exists on Alfresco, and it's provided by default configuration that you should just enable it. It will import the username, first name, last name, email, and everything. And the external subsystem will just tell to Alfresco to trust the username on the header. So if the username match the user from the LDAP, it will be the same entry in Alfresco. There will be no duplicate users with the same username. So it will be matched, and we will get the external authentication working to authenticate the users, and the LDAP working to import the data from the LDAP directories. The lady.
Does the sync process you mentioned actually do full replace or just update the incrementals?
It's updates. It creates and updates, and even deletes. If the user disappears from delete the user entry, if it disappears from your LDAP directory, and you ask Alfresco to remove it, it will remove. If you configure your LDAP subsystem to remove it, it will always keep real synchronization between the Alfresco database and the LDAP directory server.
And if you don't delete people but inactivate them on the LDAP side, what happens in the customer side?
So if you deny the authentication on the LDAP side, they won't be able to authenticate, because when they will try to access Alfresco, Alfresco will ask the LDAP. If the LDAP says no, so the login page will be thrown, or the user will be prohibited from accessing the server. Yep.
What if there are some users in the
you have users that you don't want to let go.
You just described how I can trust an external source. When they come in, they don't have a user account in Alfresco.
Exactly.
But because this is trusted, I'll allow them to come in, create the user and whatever.
Exactly, because they use the right header variable.
Maybe there's only 5 people in this group that I actually want to have access to this system. The rest of the people in that same environment, I don't want them to have access.
Yep.
How do I deny them?
Yep.
specifically?
So filtering the users from, are we talking about the LDAP or external? It's different.
Either one or. I mean, we're not going to use the LDAP, so.
Because on the LDAP, what we can do is add the new variable, or say, authorize it for Alfresco, private, yes, true, false, Alfresco, true, false, let's say. And then small customization on the existing subsystem. It is not provided out of box configuration. You will not find the property, say, denied usernames. But with small customization on the source code, because it's an open source application, you have your source code of this subsystem as well, you can just add the check before the authentication. If this variable is set to true, false, and compare and put your own subsystem, it will be working.
In our
No
case,
problem.
we're using JAWS. So how would I say some JAWS users were accepted and some aren't?
In this way, you should customize the external subsystem, not the LDAP one. Because the external you can put, even if you have few people that you want to deny from the system, you can put it's easy to do. You will just put a new configuration property, say denied users on the external subsystem stuff, and you will put a check on the username. And if the current users is on this list, return null, for example, else, and keep the existing mechanism working like it was. Yep, that I was explaining now. You can just take the same external subsystem we have and put, for example, a new property on the configuration file where you will put denied users, for example, and you will put a list of denied users. No, it's not provided out of the box. You should add this variable on the external properties file and then do a check on the external authentication component. So you have the source code, as I said. You will just open the source code, go to the authentication component class, and you can add an global if user is not on the denied list, keep the process, otherwise else, or no need even for else for this thing. You can just put an if it's not on denied stuff. It's okay? So thanks for Yep. Exactly, and you have detailed Shibboleth configuration on the wiki. Just put Alfresco Shibboleth on Google, site wiki.alfresco.com. You will get a right page with details on configuration, and it's working. So thanks for your attention for everyone, and hopefully we'll see you on the next DevCon.